Sometimes the person everyone ignores is the only one who truly sees everything. The Whitmore Room inside Manhattan's LeClaire restaurant shimmered with quiet luxury, crystal glasses catching the soft glow of chandeliers while executives discussed deals worth more than most people's homes. And at the center of the room sat Daniel Whitmore, a billionaire so known across Wall Street for building a technology empire before the age of 40. At exactly 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a tailored Navy suit that probably cost more than a month's rent in the city, Daniel carried the calm authority of someone used to being listened to. But tonight he wasn't here for business. Tonight he was here for his mother. Margaret Whitmore sat beside him, her silver hair neatly pinned and her posture graceful despite her 72 years. She watched the room with gentle curiosity, though the soft hum of conversation meant nothing to her. Margaret had been deaf since childhood. Over the decades, she had learned to read lips and understand the world in quiet ways most people never noticed, but restaurants were still difficult places. Too many voices, too many moving lips, too many people who didn't know how to slow down long enough to truly communicate. Across the dining room, a young waitress moved quietly between tables carrying a tray of sparkling water. Emily Carter had worked at LeClaire for almost a year, yet most guests barely remembered her face. She was polite, efficient, and invisible in the way service staff are often trained to be. Her brown hair was tied neatly in a low ponytail, and her black uniform blended perfectly into the elegant background of the restaurant. To most people, she looked like any other server working the late shift in Manhattan. But Emily noticed things others didn't. She noticed the way Margaret's eyes searched every face that approached the table. She noticed the small hesitation when another waiter tried speaking to her too quickly. And she noticed the polite smile Margaret gave when she couldn't fully understand what had just been said. Daniel noticed it too, though his expression remained composed. He loved his mother deeply, but moments like this reminded him how easily the world forgot people who communicated differently. The waiter finished taking their order and walked away, clearly relieved the interaction was over. Margaret sat quietly again, folding her hands in her lap. Emily stood near the service station refilling glasses, but her attention drifted back to the Whitmore table. Something about the older woman's patient smile tugged at her memory. Slowly, Emily set the pitcher down. For a moment she hesitated. Then she walked toward the table. Daniel barely looked up at first, assuming another staff member had come to ask about the order. But then he noticed something strange. The waitress didn't speak. Instead, Emily gently lifted her hands and signed a simple sentence in perfect American Sign Language. "Good evening. How are you tonight?" Margaret Whitmore blinked once. Then her entire face lit up with surprise. Her hands rose instantly in response, moving with the quick, graceful rhythm of someone who hadn't expected to be understood. And suddenly, in the middle of one of Manhattan's most expensive restaurants, a quiet conversation began that almost no one else in the room could understand. Margaret Whitmore laughed softly without making a sound, the kind of laugh that appeared first in her eyes and then in the gentle lines around her mouth. And her hands moved quickly as she replied to Emily in American Sign Language, asking how she had learned to speak with such fluency, because very few people outside the deaf community understood the language well enough to carry a real conversation. Emily answered with calm confidence, her hands steady and graceful, explaining that she had been learning sign language since she was 12 years old and that she practiced every day. Daniel Whitmore watched the exchange carefully, his attention now completely focused on the quiet waitress standing beside their table, because in all the years he had taken his mother to restaurants across New York City, he had rarely seen her light up this way. Usually conversations with strangers lasted only a few seconds before confusion took over, but this time Margaret looked fully alive, her hands moving quickly as she asked Emily where she had studied. Emily hesitated for the briefest moment before answering honestly, signing that she had studied linguistics in college for several years before life had taken her in a different direction. Margaret nodded with understanding, then signed something that made Emily smile gently, and Daniel could see that whatever they were talking about felt natural and warm in a way that money could never purchase. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm of polished service and soft music, yet a few nearby diners had started noticing that something unusual was happening at the Whitmore table, because the elegant older woman who had seemed distant only minutes ago was now laughing silently, and signing animatedly with a waitress who looked barely older than 25. Daniel leaned slightly forward, studying Emily more closely. There was nothing flashy about her appearance. Her uniform was simple, her posture professional, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who did not need attention to feel secure. But there was something else too, something that made Daniel curious. It was the way she listened with her eyes. When Margaret signed, Emily focused completely, absorbing every movement as if each gesture carried meaning beyond words. After a moment, Margaret turned toward her son and tapped his arm gently to get his attention. Her hands moved again, slower this time, so he could follow. Daniel understood enough sign language to catch the basics after years of learning to communicate with his mother, though he was far from fluent. She was telling him that the young waitress was the first person in weeks who had truly spoken with her instead of speaking around her. Daniel felt an unexpected tightening in his chest. He looked back at Emily, who stood patiently beside the table waiting to see if they needed anything else. For the first time that evening, he noticed that the room had grown quieter around them. A few nearby tables had paused their conversations, curious about the silent exchange happening in the middle of the restaurant. Daniel cleared his throat softly and spoke, his voice calm but filled with genuine curiosity as he asked Emily where exactly she had learned sign language so well. Emily met his gaze politely before answering out loud for the first time, her voice steady and warm as she explained that she had learned at home long before she ever studied it in school. And something about the way she said those two simple words made Daniel realize that this quiet waitress was hiding a story far deeper than anyone in the room could imagine. Daniel Whitmore studied Emily Carter carefully after hearing her quiet answer, the words at home lingering in his mind because they sounded simple but somehow carried more weight than they should have. In Manhattan, people usually mention prestigious universities or expensive training programs when explaining a rare skill. Yet Emily had said it with the calm honesty of someone describing something completely ordinary. Margaret Whitmore seemed to notice the same thing because her hands lifted again with renewed curiosity, asking Emily who in her family had taught her to sign so naturally. Emily paused for only a moment before replying with gentle movements of her hands, explaining that her younger brother had been born deaf and that learning sign language had simply become part of everyday life in their home. Margaret listened with deep interest, her eyes softening as she followed every motion, and Daniel could see an unspoken understanding forming between the two women, the kind that appeared when people shared experiences that others rarely thought about. Emily continued signing, explaining that when she was a teenager, she had spent hours helping her brother practice reading lips and expressing himself with confidence so that the world outside their small apartment would never feel closed to him. She described how their parents had insisted that communication inside their family would never depend on sound alone, which meant everyone learned sign language together at the dinner table, during homework, and even during movie nights when the television captions flickered quietly across the screen. Margaret smiled warmly as she listened, occasionally nodding or signing a short response that showed she understood every detail. Daniel noticed that his mother looked more animated than she had in days, perhaps even weeks. For years, he had tried to make the world more comfortable for her by hiring interpreters during business events and arranging accessible services whenever possible. But he realized now that those solutions were never quite the same as meeting someone who spoke the language naturally, without effort or formality. Emily finished explaining her story with a small, respectful gesture that meant it had simply been part of growing up, nothing extraordinary. But Daniel knew that was not entirely true. In a city filled with brilliant professionals and expensive education, the quiet waitress standing beside his table possessed a skill that had instantly transformed the evening for his mother. For the first time since arriving at the restaurant, Margaret looked relaxed rather than politely patient. She signed something slowly to Emily, and Emily nodded with understanding before translating aloud so Daniel could follow the conversation. "Your mother says she appreciates that you took the time to notice her when others did not." Daniel glanced at Margaret, who gave a gentle confirming nod, and he felt a quiet sense of gratitude that surprised him. Emily then asked Margaret if she had any favorite dishes because she would be happy to recommend something the chef prepared especially well that evening. Margaret laughed again silently and began signing a playful answer about how she always trusted the opinions of people who spoke with kindness. Nearby diners had begun watching more openly now, intrigued by the graceful conversation happening through silent gestures that seemed to flow as naturally as spoken words. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, realizing that something unusual had unfolded during what was supposed to be an ordinary dinner reservation. A waitress who had been almost invisible moments earlier had somehow become the most important person in the room, and Daniel Whitmore could not shake the feeling that the story behind her calm smile was only beginning to reveal itself. Emily Carter stepped back slightly after finishing her explanation, giving Margaret Whitmore a moment to study the menu. But Margaret was not looking at the menu at all. Instead, she watched Emily with thoughtful curiosity, as if trying to understand something beyond the simple story about a younger brother and a family that believed communication mattered. Her hands moved again, slower now, asking Emily whether her brother still lived in New York. Emily nodded gently and signed that he did, explaining that he was 20 years old now and studying computer engineering at a community college in Queens. Margaret's eyebrows lifted with pleasant surprise, and she signed that Daniel had built his first software company when he was barely older than that. Emily translated the comment out loud for Daniel with a respectful smile, and Daniel let out a quiet laugh, slightly embarrassed by the sudden praise from his mother. It had been many years since anyone at a dinner table had reminded him of those early days when he was just a young man writing code in a small apartment, long before magazine covers and business headlines. For a brief moment, Daniel looked at Emily differently, noticing the calm intelligence in her eyes that suggested she understood more about the world than her uniform implied. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant rhythm. Silverware clinked softly against porcelain plates. Glasses caught reflections from the chandeliers overhead. Yet at the Whitmore table, a different kind of atmosphere had formed, quieter and warmer than the polished formality of the rest of the room. Emily asked Margaret if she would prefer sparkling water or tea while she waited for the chef to prepare their dinner, signing the question smoothly before repeating it aloud for Daniel. Margaret signed that tea would be lovely, then added something else that made Emily pause for a moment. Emily smiled again and translated the message for Daniel. Your mother says she hopes you do not mind if she keeps me here for another minute because it has been a long time since she enjoyed a conversation like this in a restaurant. Daniel glanced at Margaret and saw the hopeful look in her eyes. For someone who spent most of her life navigating a hearing world, simple moments of easy communication were rare and precious. Daniel gave a small nod. Of course she can stay, he said quietly. Emily thanked him with a polite gesture and turned back toward Margaret, continuing the conversation through graceful movements of her hands. Margaret asked whether Emily had ever considered working as a professional interpreter because her signing was remarkably clear and expressive. Emily hesitated slightly before answering that she had thought about it once, especially during her first year of college, but life had taken her in another direction after her father became ill. Margaret listened carefully, sensing there was more to the story even though Emily kept the explanation brief. Daniel noticed the hesitation too. In his world, people often revealed their ambitions immediately, especially when speaking with someone known for hiring talented individuals. Yet Emily seemed almost determined not to draw attention to herself. She simply stood there with quiet patience, answering Margaret's questions honestly but without embellishment. As Daniel observed her more closely, a realization slowly formed in his mind. This young woman possessed the kind of natural communication skill that executives paid consultants thousands of dollars to teach, yet she carried it with the effortless humility of someone who had never considered it extraordinary. And Daniel Whitmore, a man who had spent his entire career recognizing hidden potential in technology companies and business partners, suddenly wondered if the quiet waitress beside his table might be hiding far more than a simple story about learning sign language at home. Emily Carter returned a moment later carrying a small porcelain teapot and two delicate cups balanced carefully on a polished tray, the steam rising gently as she placed them on the table with practiced grace. Margaret Whitmore watched the movement with quiet appreciation before lifting her hands again to continue their silent conversation. Emily poured the tea slowly, making sure the cup was positioned where Margaret could reach it comfortably, then signed a small explanation that the blend was a jasmine green tea the chef recommended for guests who preferred something light and calming before dinner. Margaret smiled warmly and signed that Emily seemed to know exactly what people needed before they even asked. Emily laughed softly and admitted that after working in restaurants for several years, she had learned to notice small details that others sometimes overlooked. Daniel Whitmore observed the exchange from across the table, noticing again how easily Emily moved between spoken words and sign language, as if both were simply parts of the same conversation. It was a rare kind of communication skill, the ability to make everyone in a room feel included without drawing attention to the effort involved. Margaret took a small sip of the tea and nodded with approval before signing another question that made Emily pause for a second longer than usual. She asked whether Emily still practiced sign language often now that her brother was older and busy with school. Emily answered that she did because communication was like any other language and needed practice to stay fluent. But she also explained that she volunteered on weekends at a community center in Queens where deaf students gathered for tutoring and social activities. Margaret's eyes brightened immediately. She signed that the world needed more people willing to do that kind of quiet work because too many communities remained invisible to the larger world. Emily seemed slightly embarrassed by the compliment and quickly signed that she only helped when she had time because many of the students reminded her of her brother when he was younger. Daniel listened carefully, realizing that this quiet waitress who carried plates between tables was also spending her weekends helping young people learn how to navigate a world that often moved too fast for them. In his professional life, Daniel evaluated talent every day, scanning resumes filled with impressive degrees and technical achievements. Yet the qualities he valued most were usually hidden beneath the surface: patience, awareness, the ability to understand people before speaking. Emily Carter seemed to possess all three without appearing to realize it herself. A few minutes later, the head waiter approached the table to confirm that the kitchen had begun preparing their main course. He glanced briefly at Emily, perhaps wondering why she had remained at the table longer than usual, but Daniel gave a subtle nod that signaled everything was perfectly fine. The waiter moved on without another question. Emily noticed the exchange and quietly thanked Daniel before turning back to Margaret to translate the message about their dinner arriving soon. Margaret signed that she was in no hurry because good conversations were far more satisfying than fast service. Emily laughed again, her hands moving lightly as she agreed. Daniel watched the moment with growing curiosity, realizing that the evening had shifted in a way he had not expected. A simple dinner reservation had turned into something else entirely. A quiet reminder that connection did not come from wealth or reputation, but from the rare ability to see another person clearly. And as Daniel studied Emily Carter standing beside the table with calm confidence, he began to suspect that the story behind her quiet life in Manhattan might be far more remarkable than anyone in the restaurant could guess. Emily Carter stepped away from the Whitmore table for the first time in several minutes when another server quietly signaled that one of her other tables needed attention. And although she moved quickly across the dining room, her mind still lingered on the warm conversation she had just shared with Margaret Whitmore. The restaurant lights reflected softly across polished wood floors while the low hum of conversations returned to its usual rhythm. Yet the energy around the Whitmore table had already shifted in a subtle but unmistakable way. Margaret sat back in her chair holding her teacup with both hands, her expression calm but thoughtful as she watched Emily move gracefully between tables. After a moment, she turned toward her son and began signing again, her gestures slower now so Daniel could follow more easily. She told him that the young woman had kind eyes, the kind of eyes that belonged to someone who had learned patience early in life. Daniel watched his mother carefully while she spoke with her hands, noticing the sincerity behind her words. Margaret rarely formed quick opinions about people, yet something about Emily had clearly made an impression. Daniel glanced across the room again and saw Emily returning toward their table with the same quiet professionalism she had shown all evening. When she arrived, she gave a polite smile and explained that the chef was finishing the final preparation for their dinner plates and that they would arrive within a few minutes. Margaret nodded happily and signed that she was in no hurry because the evening had already become more enjoyable than she expected. Emily translated the comment aloud for Daniel, and then added softly that Margaret had a wonderful sense of humor in sign language, something many hearing people never realized. Daniel smiled at that observation because it was true. His mother had always been expressive when signing, using subtle gestures and facial expressions that carried layers of meaning far beyond spoken words. Emily then asked Margaret another question through sign language, wondering whether she had lived in New York her entire life. Margaret replied with an amused expression and signed that she had traveled widely when Daniel was younger because his father had worked in international finance. Emily listened attentively as Margaret described visiting cities across Europe and Asia during those years, explaining that traveling as a deaf person often meant finding creative ways to communicate with strangers in unfamiliar places. Sometimes that meant writing notes. Sometimes it meant learning small pieces of different sign languages used in other countries. Emily seemed fascinated by the stories, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged Margaret to continue sharing memories. Daniel leaned back slightly and watched the exchange with quiet interest. It struck him that Emily was not only fluent in sign language, but also skilled at guiding a conversation in ways that made people feel comfortable and valued. That was a rare talent, one that executives spent years trying to master in boardrooms and negotiations. Yet Emily demonstrated it naturally while standing beside a restaurant table with a simple order pad tucked into her apron. A few moments later, another waiter arrived carrying 2 beautifully plated dinners prepared by the chef. Emily stepped aside to help place the plates in front of Daniel and Margaret, carefully ensuring that Margaret could clearly see each dish before describing it through sign language, so she would know exactly what had been served. Margaret's face brightened, again with appreciation, as Emily finished explaining the meal. Daniel watched this small gesture closely and realized that Emily Carter was not simply translating words, but translating experiences, turning an ordinary dinner into something fully accessible for his mother in a way that few people ever managed to do. And as Daniel picked up his fork, he could not help wondering how someone with such rare empathy and communication skill had quietly ended up serving tables in one of Manhattan's busiest restaurants. Daniel Whitmore took a slow bite of the chef's carefully prepared salmon while watching his mother closely, and it did not take long for him to notice that Margaret was not focused on the food at all. Her attention kept drifting toward Emily Carter as the young waitress moved gracefully between nearby tables, checking on guests and refilling glasses with the same calm efficiency she had shown all evening. Margaret finally lifted her hands again and signed something directly to Daniel, her expression thoughtful and warm at the same time. She told him that the young woman reminded her of someone she had known many years ago, someone who believed that the most important skill in life was not speaking, but listening. Daniel considered the idea for a moment before glancing back toward Emily. In the corporate world he lived in, conversations were often loud and fast and competitive, with people interrupting one another in a rush to prove their intelligence. Yet Emily had done the exact opposite. She had listened first, observed carefully, and only spoken when she knew her words would matter. A few minutes later, Emily returned to the table to check whether Margaret enjoyed the meal. She signed the question with the same easy rhythm as before, and Margaret immediately responded with enthusiasm, explaining that the salmon was excellent and that she appreciated the way Emily had described the dish before serving it. Emily translated the message aloud for Daniel and added that the chef would be very happy to hear that compliment. Daniel nodded politely, but this time he did not let Emily leave the table immediately. Instead, he asked a simple question that had been forming in his mind for the past several minutes. He asked whether she had ever considered working in a field where her communication skills might reach more people than a restaurant dining room. Emily paused, clearly surprised by the question, and for a brief moment, she looked as if she might laugh it off politely. But when she met Daniel's eyes, she realized he was not joking. She explained carefully that she had once planned to continue studying linguistics and possibly become a professional interpreter, but circumstances had changed when her father became ill during her second year of college. Emily described how medical bills and family responsibilities had forced her to leave school earlier than she expected. Working at the restaurant allowed her to support her family while her younger brother continued his education. Margaret listened quietly while Emily signed the explanation again so she could follow every detail. When Emily finished, Margaret reached forward and gently touched Daniel's sleeve before signing a short sentence that carried unexpected weight. She told him that sometimes the most capable people are the ones the world notices last because they are too busy helping others to promote themselves. Daniel felt the truth of those words immediately. In business, he had built companies by recognizing hidden potential where others saw ordinary circumstances. And as he looked at Emily Carter standing beside the table with quiet dignity, he realized that the same instinct was beginning to whisper to him again. This waitress had not tried to impress anyone. She had simply helped his mother feel included in a room that rarely slowed down for people like her. And for Daniel Whitmore, a man who had spent years searching for exceptional minds in crowded markets, that small moment of genuine care might have been the most remarkable talent he had seen all week. Emily Carter stood quietly beside the Whitmore table for a moment after finishing her explanation, her hands resting lightly at her sides while the soft glow of the chandelier lights reflected across the polished tableware. Daniel Whitmore remained silent as he processed what she had said about leaving college and supporting her family, and although his expression stayed calm, there was a noticeable shift in the way he looked at her now. He was no longer seeing only a waitress doing her job. He was studying someone whose choices revealed a level of responsibility and character that many people in his professional world claimed to value but rarely practiced. Margaret Whitmore noticed the change immediately. Her eyes moved between Daniel and Emily with quiet curiosity before she lifted her hands again to continue the conversation. She signed slowly so Daniel could follow, explaining that the most meaningful talents in life were often discovered not in classrooms, but in moments when people were forced to choose between ambition and compassion. Emily watched Margaret's hands carefully and then translated the message aloud so Daniel could hear every word clearly. Daniel gave a thoughtful nod because he understood exactly what his mother meant. In the technology industry, people often spoke about innovation as if it came from brilliant ideas alone. But Daniel knew from experience that real progress usually came from people who cared deeply about solving problems that affected others. Emily's story suggested that she was exactly that kind of person. Emily seemed slightly uncomfortable with the attention and quickly shifted the conversation back toward the dinner itself, asking Margaret whether she enjoyed the jasmine tea with the meal or if she preferred something different for the next course. Margaret smiled warmly and signed that the tea was perfect, but then she added something unexpected that made Emily pause before translating it aloud. Your mother says that sometimes life quietly places people in front of us for a reason, even when we do not notice it at first. Daniel looked at Margaret with mild surprise, because she rarely spoke in philosophical statements unless something truly meaningful had happened. Emily translated the sentence with gentle care and then glanced at Daniel briefly as if wondering how he might interpret it. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and looked around the restaurant for a moment. Conversations continued at nearby tables. Waiters moved smoothly between guests. The evening appeared completely ordinary to everyone else in the room. Yet for Daniel, the night had clearly shifted into something else. He turned back toward Emily and asked one more question, this time with a tone that carried genuine interest rather than casual curiosity. He asked whether she still hoped to return to college one day and finish her degree in linguistics if the opportunity appeared again. Emily hesitated, her eyes lowering briefly toward the table before she answered honestly. She explained that she still loved studying languages and communication, but right now her priority was making sure her brother completed his education without the same financial struggle she had faced. Margaret listened carefully to the translation and then signed something with quiet certainty that Emily read immediately. Emily's eyes widened slightly before she looked back at Daniel and spoke the words aloud. She says that the world has a way of rewarding people who choose kindness first, even if it takes time for that reward to appear. Daniel Whitmore held Emily's gaze for a moment longer than usual, and in that quiet pause he began to realize that the evening might not end the way it began, because sometimes the most important opportunities appear when someone least expects them. Emily Carter remained beside the Whitmore table for a quiet moment after translating Margaret's words, the soft glow of the restaurant lights reflecting gently across the polished silverware, while the quiet rhythm of the dining room continued around them. Daniel Whitmore studied her expression carefully, recognizing the humility in the way she spoke about her future. In his experience, most people became noticeably excited when discussing opportunities. Yet Emily seemed focused only on the responsibilities that mattered most to her. Margaret Whitmore watched the exchange with a calm and knowing smile before lifting her hands once more. Her gestures were slow and deliberate, carrying the thoughtful wisdom that came from decades of observing how the world treated different kinds of people. She signed that kindness often traveled quietly, sometimes moving through years of effort before anyone truly noticed it. Emily read the message and translated it softly so Daniel could understand every word. Daniel remained silent for a moment, absorbing both the meaning of Margaret's statement and the evening that had unfolded in front of him. When he had first walked into the restaurant that night, he had expected nothing more than a quiet dinner with his mother after a long week of meetings and business negotiations. Yet the conversation they had just experienced had reminded him of something he had not thought about in years. The most valuable ideas in his career had never come from crowded boardrooms or polished presentations. They had appeared when someone saw a problem others overlooked and cared enough to solve it. Emily Carter had done exactly that when she noticed his mother sitting quietly at the table and chose to speak to her in the language that made her feel included. Daniel looked across the dining room where other guests continued enjoying their meals without realizing how much the atmosphere at one small table had changed. Then he turned back toward Emily and spoke in a tone that was calm but sincere. He told her that the world needed more people who understood communication the way she did. Emily seemed surprised by the statement and replied modestly that she had simply done what felt natural. Margaret smiled warmly at that answer and signed something again with gentle certainty. Emily read the message and hesitated briefly before translating it aloud. Your mother says that the most meaningful talents are the ones people use without realizing how rare they are. Daniel nodded slowly because he knew that observation was true. After a quiet pause, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple business card, placing it carefully on the edge of the table where Emily could see it. He explained that his company often worked with international partners and that clear communication between cultures and communities was more important than most people understood. He told her that if she ever decided to return to her studies or explore opportunities beyond the restaurant, she should consider reaching out. Emily looked at the card with visible surprise, not because of the name printed on it, but because the offer itself had arrived so unexpectedly. Margaret watched the moment unfold with a satisfied expression, as if she had quietly anticipated this outcome long before Daniel spoke. Emily thanked him politely and said she would keep the card safe, though she still had many responsibilities to consider before making any changes in her life. Daniel respected the honesty in her answer and simply nodded. As Emily stepped away to continue her work across the restaurant, Margaret turned toward her son with a knowing smile and signed one final thought. She told him that sometimes the people who seem invisible to the world are the ones who remind us what truly matters. Daniel glanced once more toward the quiet waitress moving gracefully through the dining room and realized that the evening had given him something far more valuable than a business opportunity. It had given him a reminder that genuine understanding begins when someone chooses to see another person clearly, even in a room where everyone else is too busy to notice.